When I was a student at UCLA, I was studying psychology, and I had one professor in particular that was adamant about the idea that no humans had any free will. He would always harp on this point, and it was as though he was committed to the idea that nobody should leave his class without believing that no free will existed. See, he came from a perspective that everything must be physical. And he had spent so much time looking at the science of the brain that he had started to doubt whether any free will could exist. See, modern advancements in science have told us a lot about the brain, and now we can point to certain parts of the brain that operate when we're feeling a certain way, when we're thinking something over and trying to make a critical decision. There's certain chemicals in our brain that if we have a little bit too much of, a little bit less of, it will change the way we feel. Even might influence things like mental illness. And so through this study of the science behind how the brain works, this professor had become convinced that everything was like a series of dominoes, that everything was just a series of events occurring in the brain. A chemical was emitted by the brain, it was absorbed by another part of the brain, this caused some type of other physical reaction, and essentially one thing leads to another, and that the brain was not acting in a free way in terms of making free decisions, but was instead just simply reacting to physical things which were happening in the brain. And so he would say that when we as humans perceived that we had free will, like we perceived making a decision about where do I want to go to lunch today? I got a few options. Which one am I going to choose? We might perceive ourselves as choosing one over the other. But in reality, the choice was essentially inevitable because a certain process was occurring in our brain which was going to lead us to make whatever the decision was. Essentially, everything was predestined, but not predestined by a god, or instead by the physical processes. From essentially the moment of birth, everything was just a series of dominoes. And so our perception of making decisions was just one more domino falling over that made us think that we were thinking, think that we were making decisions, think that we were feeling a certain way. Now, he wouldn't say that it was totally an illusion. He understood that, yeah, we really did feel the things we felt, and we really did experience the thoughts that we were having, but that those were essentially either meaningless, or they're not meaningful in the same way that maybe Christians would say. Christians would talk about, and a lot of other religious people would talk about, a soul. In fact, people who are not religious at all would often believe in a soul. It's a commonly held belief that there's something inside us that's greater than our bodies, than the limitations of our bodies. But he would argue different, that there is no soul, there's no you apart from your brain, and that your perception of yourself as being something separate is not a true perception. Now, I think this causes a few problems, but the one I want to talk about today is in the issue of moral laws, moral obligations, right and wrong. See, if there's no soul, there's no person that's bigger than our physical bodies, then we become essentially a physical object. And if there's no free will, then that physical object is our bodies are just reacting to a design, for lack of a better term, a system that already exists, and it's just kind of going through the motions. So when I look at another object like a rock, I don't have a moral obligation to the rock to be nice to it, to be not nice to it. If I leave it on the ground, pick it up, throw it, whatever I want to do, it doesn't really matter because I have no moral obligation to that rock, and that rock cannot wrong me. If a rock falls off of the roof of my house as I'm walking out the door and hits me on the head, I might be upset that it happened, but it's not evil. There's no moral issue here because it's simply an object. And if humans are simply objects, we might perceive that we have free will, perceive a consciousness, but ultimately are just a object going through its motions, then would we have any moral obligations? Would we be capable of doing right and wrong? You know, the killer who kills another person, could we even say that murder could be wrong? I mean, the killer themselves would just be an object going through its predetermined motions. You know, there's something in its brain that's just causing it to take these steps that ultimately leads to the death of another person. And the person, if we could even call them that person that gets killed, well, they're just an object too, going through its predetermined motions. And so, is there really any right or wrong to the situation? I mean, how could we wouldn't blame two objects that have no free will for whatever occurs between them. Now, we might say like, hey, a rock is very simple and basic, and humans are so complex. Maybe there's some higher moral obligation that we have. But if you look at my car's not as complex as me, but it's much more complex than the rock. The complexity does not really change, though, the moral obligations. I don't have more of an obligation to treat my car nice than I do a rock. I might prefer to treat my car right because it costs me a lot of money and it would cost a lot of money to fix. But ultimately, if I want to throw a rock down a hill or push my car down a hill, there's no moral weight to any of that. It's all just objects. And so while we might be a very complicated object, if we really lack free will, if we are really limited to just simply the physical structure, then I think we need to be prepared to give up the idea of any type of right or wrong. Justice itself would cease to exist practically for us. You know, there would be no purpose in us trying to strive for a just society, to improve society, to stop evil from happening, if this is just a series of objects. If all the quote-unquote bad people in the world are just going through the motions that their brains set apart, then they're not really bad, and there's no sense in us trying to stop them because it's inevitable that they'll be the way they are. And there's nobody really to protect because everything is just physical. Everything is just objects. And while we might perceive ourselves as existing in some other state, and we might perceive that we have emotions and we're making decisions, ultimately those things aren't going to happen. They're not real. So they don't really matter. I mean, is that what are we prepared to bite that off? I think if you subscribe to such an idea, then you need to let go that human beings have no free will. Then you need to let go of all ideas of justice. But if you care about justice, you care about our culture today, what's changing in society, what things can we do to improve it, what things of the past that were wrong do we want to move away from? If we care about those things, well, then we must accept the idea that there's free will, that there's a person that is greater than their body. And if that is the case, then there must be a soul.